Since the game has launched over 2 weeks ago, I put in well above 100 hours into my rogue, obviously leveled to 100. I leveled a couple of glyphs to 20 and a couple more above 15 to test a few different builds. For example, the traps build, which I enjoyed quite a lot. It was very effective for leveling. It was also effective for pushing in some nightmare dungeons, but I ended up reverting back to the high DPS Twisted Blades build because this one offered better single target DPS. It also allowed me to push a little bit higher into my nightmare tier dungeons. I made it all the way to 68 so far, but at some point realized that we can probably get the best of both worlds. So I decided to combine the traps build with the best of the single target DPS build, or the high damage one, which is basically poison imbuement. And that's exactly what I've been running for the past couple of days, and I found this to be the most effective overall. I can tweak a few pieces or a few skills to be a very effective single target DPS, but overall this offers, like I said, the best of both worlds. So in today's video, I want to go over how I built this character, what you need to achieve this, and then hopefully with your feedback, maybe even a couple of tips and tricks that you guys might have for me, we can further improve this build. So all that said, let's jump right in. Let me first start by explaining how this build works. We're using Death Trap along with Poison Trap to pull down and knock down the enemies, and then we're going to be using Twisted Blades along with Poison Imbuement to deal our damage. As for mobility, you will notice that we drop the dash ability. It is effective for moving around, but for positioning it is not my favorite. I much prefer Shadow Step and the evade function. We have plenty of movement speed on our gear, and with the extra movement speed you get from Shadow Step, we're basically at cap for a couple of seconds, so it's still pretty effective to move around in dungeons. Then for the specialization, we're using Preparation and the Exposure passive to basically reset our skills every couple of seconds, and this is what makes it so efficient in my opinion. We could be using Inner Sight for more energy generation against bosses, which I sometimes do, but the build as is can still perform relatively well against bosses. As for our survivability, we're using a lot of crowd control through the Daze ability, the knockdown ability. We have a lot of damage reduction on our gear. We also have some dodge going, and we have some lifesteal on one of our passives. So we're literally at our strongest when we are in packs of mobs, but when we are running between packs, that is when we are our weakest because we're losing our stacks from some of the aspects, for example, the one where you get more armor, right? So like I said, you could do a little bit better for single target DPS on the fly by changing your specialization. You could even remove 3 points from your Death Trap and add it to your Shadow Clone, for example, and then you would be a pretty effective single target DPS. So overall, this is the best setup that I came up with for the time being. So now let's go over the gear and the skills. So pretty standard skills setup. We have made a few tweaks, so let's quickly go over them. We are still using Puncture with the same passives. For Twisting Blades, we've decided to drop the advanced one and instead using the improved one for the extra days. Same passives over here as we've used before. Shadow Step, you only need 1 point. I do like to use this passive for the extra stun for stagger on bosses, but also crowd control on some elites or just regular mobs. Then we're using Weapon Mastery, obviously really important for extra damage. 1 point in each of these right here. Not necessary. I guess it just really depends. So knocking back and knocking down is obviously good for regular mobs and elites, but not so good for bosses. So you may want to put that point elsewhere. I do like to have 1 point in this one because as you daze enemies, you reset or you reduce the cooldown of your evade. So really, really efficient to get more evades to either position yourself or to evade out of danger. Depending on which type of boot you use, it might also not be as important. So if you have the boots that you have more evade charges, maybe you don't want it, but I have the boots right now that reduces the cooldown on attacks. So between this and that type of boot, I basically have my evade up almost all the time. Then trick attacks is obviously important for even more crowd control. I am using 3 points in agile right here. You don't necessarily need to do this. Those 3 points could be spent elsewhere, for example, in trap mastery for even more critical strike chance, which is really important for our build, but I am experimenting with some extra dodge for the time being. Then we have 1 point in poison trap and 1 in enhanced poison trap. I suppose you could put 1 point in this one, but not necessary right now because we're resetting our skills so quickly. Exploits and malice, obviously really important. maxed out poison imbuement with those passives. I do like to have this passive maxed out for extra survivability, which may not be needed, if you're doing like lower level content, but if you are pushing for higher tier dungeons, I would suggest you get this one. I'm not a fan of this one right here overall because it does give you some extra attack speed when you're packs of mobs, but it doesn't necessarily do much when you're fighting bosses. Then for the other passives over here, we have Innervation along with Adrenaline Rush and 3 points into Haste for more movement speed like I talked about before, but also more attack speed when you are below 50% energy, right? And then for our ultimate, Death Trap and the Exposure passive, and this combined with our specialization of Preparation is what makes everything work. The gear is a work in progress. I am still testing a few different setups, but here's what I've settled with for the time being. Our helm is obviously a defensive piece, but the rolls on our helm can be somewhat offensive at the same time. So we do have cooldown reduction, plus for the poison imbuement. This is kind of to mimic a Harlequin crest or the Shaco, which would basically kind of look like this, minus perhaps the intelligence, which would be all stats. But I am, for the time being, working with one of my secondary stats to reach at least 440 on both of them, right? So strength and intelligence. Then our chest piece is very defensive with one offensive roll, and our aspect is damage reduction from crowd-controlled enemies, as well as movement speed when we get hit by them. So that is one extra source of movement speed for us to hit our cap. The gloves are obviously offensive, so crit chance, lucky hit, and attack speed are probably best in slot, and then obviously whichever skill you are focusing on, which in this case is Twisting Blades. For the aspect, we're using the one where you're going to basically daze them when they are vulnerable, so this is again more crowd control. So between this and the daze that we get on our Twisting Blades, we effectively have daze up on pretty much all the enemies when we start a fight. Then for the pants, very defensive. We have the aspect that gives us more strength. We probably would want the pants that gives us a barrier instead of extra resource when we're injured and using a potion, but these are the ones that I've been using for the past couple of days. I have some different ones, some that have the rubies in them for extra life, for example. The rubies are decent, but overall, the topaz are the best in my opinion because you get even more damage reduction. And this one is while you are crowd controlled impaired, which every so often does happen. So it is nice to have that little bit of extra survivability. But same concept here, damage reduction from close enemies, poison enemies, life is good as well. And like I said, I am experimenting with dodge, so I do have one roll of dodge on there. You could have another roll of dodge, which is dodge from close enemies, which I would like to test in the next couple of days. Then for our boots, energy cost reduction is really good. We can get some dodge on there, so I do have it. Damage reduction while injured is one of the places you can get, and then obviously movement speed. And for the aspect, the extra shadow step charge is absolutely amazing. As for our amulet, it could be defensive, it could be offensive. I am running an offensive one for the time being. And the aspect is that your imbuement skills have increased effectiveness against vulnerable enemies. So this is a huge source of damage. Movement speed on here, I think, is a must. Cooldown reduction here would be really good if I could get it. And also resource cost reduction come to mind as some of the best in slot, in my opinion. But for the time being, I have imbuement skill damage, and attack speed for 4 seconds after dodging. Again, I am experimenting with dodge, and I'll explain why I'm stacking more attack speed in a little bit. Then for the rings, lucky hit, crit chance, vulnerable damage, crit damage is all pretty much best in slot. In this case, we have physical damage, might not be ideal, but it works for the time being. And then for the aspect, we have the attack speed after core skills, or critical hit from a core skill. As for the second ring, this is where we're generating more resource or energy. So we are using the one where when you crowd control an enemy, you regenerate some energy. This is the worst possible roll. I have yet to actually get a decent roll of this aspect, but very, very efficient, especially that we are using the preparation. And then for the rolls on the ring, kind of the same concept here, crit chance, lucky hit, crit damage. You could put some life on your rings if you feel you don't have enough, but for the content that I'm doing right now, it is sufficient. Then for our weapons, obviously the main two-hand is for Twisting Blades. And what you want on your rolls here would be dex, crit damage, vulnerable damage, and then you could have close damage. Damage to poison enemies does work as well. So again, very offensive. I am debating whether or not to add a roll of all stats on some of my weapons, maybe not this one, but the goal is to try and reach almost 540 or 30 on each of your secondary stats to get more out of your Paragon points, but that is another work in progress. Then for our two one-hand weapons, I am using daggers for the extra attack speed, as I believe that the attack speed is a little bit more efficient, let's say, for generating energy with your lucky hit, but also for loading, for example, on an aspect like this one, where it is basically on hit, right? So the faster you attack, the faster you can load this in between fights or during fights. As for the aspects and rolls on these weapons, same concept: vulnerable damage, crit damage, dex, and damage to poisoned enemies or damage to close enemies is all good stuff. And I'm using the unique Ashera's Kanjar, I believe it's pronounced, for extra attack speed. And aside from the lucky hit roll on this weapon, the rest is not that great. It doesn't do much for us. The movement speed, we're usually capped anyway, so it's not necessarily something that I'm looking for. So sometimes I may just drop this and instead use this one right here, which is the same concept: vulnerable damage, close damage, critical strike damage, and dex, right? As for the aspect, we are using the one called the Blast Trapper. Really, really important. This allows you to apply vulnerable pretty much on all the enemies the second you start a fight, and it lasts for about 3 seconds, which is usually the time it takes for you to kill a pack of mobs. And then for the other aspect, for example, that we would use on the secondary weapon if we don't use the unique, it would be this one right here. So you get more crowd control and you get a lot more critical strike against injured enemies. So very, very efficient. So overall, that is the gear that I have been using. You see down here that I have a couple pieces that I swap when I'm doing my single target DPS build, which I will cover in a separate video. Now let's go check the Paragon points. So this is obviously a work in progress. Don't just blindly copy this. I will have a link to the build for you guys in the description anyway, but I will most likely change this up. The concept that I was trying to do here is to create something that was a little bit more universal for all the builds that I wanted to try, whether it be melee or range. So this is kind of what I settled with for the time being. It has only 5 glyph sockets and 2 legendary powers, but I know that you can do 6 glyph sockets with 2 legendary powers, for example. So obviously there is some room for optimization. Let me still just quickly go over what I currently have. Starter board is closer. Then we have exploit weakness along with the turf. Up next is the tricks of the trade along with the bane. After that, I've got the deadly ambush along with the diminish. And after that, I've got the Leirana. So this is where I said I was kind of working with the dodge mechanic and then more attack speed. And finally, I have the cheap shot for the crowd extra damage from when you have crowd controlled enemies around you, right? So a couple things to note real quick here. If you're going to work with like 6 boards, is that it gets really hard to get the most out of these rare nodes because you don't always have enough of your secondary stat, but sometimes it is only your main stat, for example, so you can get some decent benefits out of working with more boards, right? But hitting the 530 for your secondary stats is also quite hard. So even your 5th board is actually not fully utilized, right? But then the previous ones where you reach at least 440 for intelligence, for example, and then 440 for strength, right? So that is what I wanted on my gear first, but as I try to min-max a little bit more, I will try to reach even more of the secondary stat. One quick note to point out about this kind of traps build, I guess, is that you do want to get these points right here. It makes a huge difference for them to arm quicker so that when you jump into a pack, it triggers the knockdown faster, right? If you don't have this, I found that I would more often than not die because I wasn't crowd controlling them quickly enough, okay? And finally, one more thing to point out is obviously the damage reduction that you get from these boards. I think that's kind of the concept of what I wanted here, right? To get as much damage reduction as possible, because as you're pushing for higher tier dungeons, and because we are melee, we tend to take a whole lot of damage when we're jumping in those packs, okay? So there you go, guys. That is the build that I've been using. I would love to have your thoughts in the comments section below. Let me know what you think. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.